is going to be the introduction into AP World. So let's just get started. So, one of the key topics in AP World is religion and how that interacts with, people, and, how that basically most of the wars that were caused were generally by some type of religious belief, but more, even, times of peace were caused by stability from religion. So, religion was definitely a very important thing throughout AP World and will be on the AP World exam. So, in the very beginning, one of the earliest religions there were Judaism and Zoroastrianism. Butchered that pronunciation, but yeah. So, there were key parts of both. So, Judaism, the one that's a little bit more popular nowadays, is one of the earliest monotheistic religions. So they believed in one powerful, all-knowing God, and they emphasized a lot of law, like Torah, and covenant and moral responsibility. However, Zoroastrianism, which has pretty much died out at this time, which was developed in ancient Persia by the prophet Zoroaster, or yeah, is often considered a dualistic religion rather than strictly monotheistic because it kind of focused on two different lords, I suppose, like Ahura Mazda, which was a supreme god figure, and then the destructive spirit. Oh, that should be there. Okay, so Judaism Hebrew texts. There are two types of important codes that we will have to learn about. Oh, where did it go? Hammurabi's code, which was in Egypt, and the Bible. You've probably heard of stuff like an eye for an eye, or maybe you've heard of something where it's oh, if they stole something, they would cut off their hand, or something like that. That's pretty much these texts, right? Like Hammurabi's codes. They both emphasize justice, punishment, and the idea of moral responsibility. So you'd see, again, phrases like eye for an eye. So then you would have proportionate retribution. So as we know, all of these things influence each other. So Hammurabi's laws may have been influenced by Hebrew laws, during the Babylonian exile. These things could have been connected to each other. Here are some of the 10 Commandments, where you can see key terms like you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. The last few laws are very don't do bad things, do good things. But you'll see the first ones where it's just you will have no other gods before me, or you will not make any idols, or something like that. So the first four are really focused on the religious aspect, and the last few are focused on more of the moral aspect of the religion. So here's some historical context. You might have heard here I was talking about I was referencing the Babylonian exile. Here is so after the Babylonian exile, many Jews that migrated over, they lived under the Persian, the Achaemenid rule, where I will talk about this later, but Cyrus the Great, he famously allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, all of this stuff as a Zoroastrian. So this period really led to cultural and theological exchange. So there are like I was discussing earlier, there are lots of similarities between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. So you'll see heaven and hell, angels and demons, a final judgment, resurrection of the dead. These themes translate to from Zoroastrianism to Judaism, and you'll see these same themes reappear in Christianity or other religions, which is one thing that AP World's really about, is watching how ideas can transfer from one group to another and how they communicate that way. So the first and largest empire that most of AP World will discuss, the first one, will be the Achaemenid Empire, which was founded in ancient Persia, founded by Cyrus the Great. So, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and is famous for like tolerance. I'll talk about him a little bit later. Um, and then Darius, the person who took over after him, he organized the empire into satrapies or provinces using satraps, built the royal road, which did a whole lot of stuff. Like it introduced so much like communication. He introduced a standard currency and administrative system. The last one, Xerxes, is quite popular, I'd say, in media. If you watched, I forgot what it was called. It was like something 300, Sparta 300, something like that. But it shows him like decked out in this like kind of evil kind of look. He's known for invading Greece during the Persian Wars, so perhaps that's where the image came from. He was also known to be like not the best out of his lineage. Who was Cyrus the Great? So this is where we'll expand more on him. He was the founder, and one of the more defining factors of him was his religious tolerance, where he included Babylonians, sorry, Greeks, Jews, Medes. Like, he obviously there's no such thing as like completely being tolerant. Like he was just tolerant compared to people like of that time. Most people would like execute people that weren't like in the same religion, same culture, same identity. But he accepted a bunch of these people. He was relatively progressive. Again, for the time, he was relatively progressive. He focused on key factors like diplomacy. So, second wave civilization. So this is where we're actually getting into like thicker AP world content. Societies will become more complex and politically organized during this time. You'll see this is like the backdrop, basically. The rise of large empires and independent city-states. So let's talk a little bit about what city-states are and that versus empires. City-states are small, independent political units centered around a city and its surrounding territory. So some examples of this might be, I'm sure many people have heard about Athens and Sparta, and then the Mayan city-states in Mesoamerica. So there's some benefits of this. You can get local control and autonomy, lots of civic participation, especially a defining feature of Athens, which was like democratic systems, and it'll be culturally distinct and innovative. However, it will be prone to internal conflict and rivalry as there's no like strict control, right? The local control and autonomy allows like people to have that ability to be a little bit more creative with their choices, but it also means that there is no control, basically. There will be limited resources and military power, and because of all of these issues, they might be vulnerable to conquest by larger empires. We'll see this in history, where lots of city-states are not able to withstand, like, empire rule. Empires, however, are large political units that bring together diverse peoples, often through conquest under one centralized authority. So some example of this might be the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, Han China, the Mauryan Empire, and Gupta empires. The strengths of this is you'll see the political stability, and most of the time, and infrastructure, like roads, bureaucracy, law. You'll see economic integration and trade across vast territories, cultural exchange and innovation. However, there come some weaknesses with this too, because it is hard to manage due to the size and diversity. You'll see how many empires like fall because of this, like the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, spoilers, but yeah, many of them fall because they've expanded too far. There's a risk of rebellion or collapse if central authority weakens, so it almost happens all the time. You're always going to have these revolts. If someone is taking control over a large amount of area, there's going to be revolts. There's going to be people that don't agree with what they're doing. It's just more common in places or in empires. And they often rely on military force and heavy taxation. So again, people will not be happy and probably have a rebellion. Okay, so here's some 3 theories of history. The Great Man theory argues that history is shaped primarily by the actions of exceptional individuals who make big changes like Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, Mahatma Gandhi, or Martin Luther King Jr. The Common People theory says that history is driven by the collective actions and struggles of ordinary people, especially workers, peasants, and marginalized groups. Some examples of this might be labor movements, civil rights protests, revolutions, grassroots activism. Materialistic theory, we will talk about that later, Marxist and stuff, but they often see economic and material conditions as the primary drivers of historical change. And like we will talk about in the industrial revolution, feudalism to capitalism transition, and stuff like that. But I'm just putting these out here. It might be better for you to learn those things, then come back to this and take a look at that first, and then try to figure out what fits into what groups. Let's start our introduction into the Greeks and the classical era. So, the classical era was known as the golden age of art, philosophy, politics, military strength. Like, at this time, like, when you think about Greek, this tends to be the time that you think about, like, more. Lots of Persian wars led to Greek city-states such as Athens and Sparta entered a period of intense cultural and intellectual development. So, Athens became like the birthplace of democracy, what it's known for. You probably heard of like philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They laid the foundation for thoughts that continue to this day. So then between all these little wars, Peloponnesian War that weakened the city-states, which paved the way for the rise of Macedonia under like Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, who continued to spread this Greek culture across such a big empire. There were some prominent Greek values that might appear on the test, such as arete, or excellence or virtue, which is trying to be the most you can be, like the pursuit of one's highest potential. This will be seen through bravery, skill in battle, and intellect. You'll also see hubris, which is excessive pride or arrogance. Lots of times in Greek stories, you'll see this as a fatal flaw. Like, the hero will basically have so much pride that they think that they can defy the gods, or thinking oneself as invincible, and then it'll be like a fable, like a moral story, basically. You'll see Aristotle proposed like the golden mean, which is a mathematical thing basically, but it was all about like balance and moderation. You could probably search up a video of this on YouTube. It's very fascinating, but how everything is like proportional, like very common in art at the time. The downfall of Greek city-states. So what I was talking about before, the Peloponnesian War. So Athens and Sparta fought a brutal war that drained like all the resources, devastated cities, and weakened like all of the city-states. Although Sparta won, it couldn't like keep that control, so then there continued to be warfare among the city-states, and Greece was just more fragmented than anything. Like, it was very vulnerable to anything attacking it. So, yeah, Thebes briefly rose to power, but like, there wasn't any unification there. So what happened here was that Philip II, or the King of Macedonia, took advantage of this, and he basically created this army, used diplomacy and conquest, and dominated Greece. So, after the assassination of Philip II, like, his son Alexander takes the throne at 20. Talking about Alexander, he invaded Asia Minor and defeated Darius III in key battles, so he was able to do that. And then he founds Alexandria in Egypt and reaches as far as the Indus River. Like, his empire was so vast. But he died in Babylon without naming a successor. And after his death, the generals basically split the empire into kingdoms. There were like, the empire fragmented on its own. It spread so far that it was pretty much impossible to maintain. And even then, like, Alexander did not name a successor. So, what happened here is the cultural blending, where Greek language, art, and architecture and ideas like spread throughout the Mediterranean and into Asia, and this was called Hellenism. Very important idea. I would say if there's anything to get from this, it's Hellenism, which is where from this moment a fusion of like Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures like kind of fused together. This was seen in cities, sculpture, science, philosophy. Like, this laid the foundation for many of the ideas that were proposed today. Okay. Here's some examples of Hellenistic art. You can see like lots of expression, lots of like anatomy, lots of just everything kind of combined into one. some could say this is the peak art, but you know. Key contributions of Rome. Oh, did I skip stuff? Okay, so sure. So Rome was another great empire that spanned a large span of area. Like you'll see, I'll talk about it later, but when it broke apart, it like split Europe in two. But key contributions of Rome were republicanism, separation of power, and written law. Roads, aqueducts, concrete arches, the Latin language, which again plays an important part into like something that comes later, like Christianity, epic poetry and rhetoric, and glorification of conquest and military strength. So what happens in the beginning is that there were in Rome, like towards the very beginning, like patricians. It was divided into patricians and plebeians. Patricians were wealthy land-owning upper class in ancient Rome, and plebeians were like the common people. Okay, I'm going to do this one first. The Roman Republic. So it went from the Greek direct democracy from Athens to the Roman Republic, which is a representative democracy. Direct democracy basically means that the citizens vote on laws directly. And this was a republic, so citizens will elect officials to represent them. Republic led to an empire because the gradual concentration of power in military leaders like Julius Caesar led to the erosion of senatorial power. What did Rome leave behind? So these are some things that kind of added onto the stuff here. But the written laws, the 12 tables, were the first publicly posted legal code in Roman history, which ensured transparency and equal access to justice. In theory, this didn't happen, obviously, like most things in history where they were supposed to be progressive, but they didn't get as progressive as they wanted it to be. Still, this was a great first step. Some legal principles were also introduced, such as innocent until proven guilty, which is still in our court to this day. Right to face one's accuser, and use of evidence in trial. These are all important things that ensure that we have great legal code. Concrete. Rome preferred concrete, which allowed them to build massive and lasting structures. They, again, arch, vault, dome, had all these great innovations. Aqueducts, which transported fresh water into cities, and roads. One of the most important things that Romans had were lots of roads. Because this increased administrative power, things could get across really easily. It just made things a lot easier for Rome, especially considering it was so big. Colosseum and Pantheon are some popular, I'm pretty sure you've heard of them, but popular architectures. Another thing that emerged was Stoicism. Something like that, which was emphasized reason, virtue, and endurance. It was a very popular philosophy at the time. You'll see the rise of Christianity, realism and sculpture, gladiator games. I'm not sure if that's great, but so here's some Roman values, like the Greek values, arte, hubris, etc. Roman values had something similar. So they had gravitas instead, where it was like seriousness, dignity, and responsibility. You'll see a lot of times in Roman sculptures, you might see like very serious features, very like furrowed eyebrows, something like that. But that kind of emphasized that gravitas, like you have this responsibility, you have to be serious, especially for the men there. Like that was a norm, a cultural norm. Paterfamilia, which is the male head of a Roman family. So he had complete authority over his household. He controlled property, arranged marriages, and had the power of life and death over the family member. So again, women did not have any legal power at this time, but one of the main reasons was because of this. Like, they concentrated so many power into, like, the male head. You will see this contrast with, like, Sparta. Although Spartan women didn't have much power, but when Spartan men were, like, required to go to war, basically. So when they all went to war, that basically left the entire village, entire town, entire city to the hands of the women there. Additionally, Spartan women were encouraged to exercise a lot and participate in sports because they like thought the physique would be great for birthing babies. But so they definitely had more power than like other groups at their time. No, Romans did not want that. However, Romans did have a Pax Romana, which began under Augustus Caesar's rule after the civil wars. This was basically just peace. Like, so many empires after this tried to replicate this, but it was basically just peace that was so unobtainable for many people. Um, Fall of the Roman Republic. What was really going on? So, what happened was there was a class conflict between patricians, or elite, and plebeians, commoners. So they found corruption in the Senate and provincial governors. There was unrest among the poor. You'll see most of the falls end up being because of unrest among the poor. Um, Slave revolts, including Spartacus rebellion. We'll talk about that later as well. And powerful generals with personal armies that were loyal to the generals. Like the armies were loyal to the generals, but not the state. So let's talk a little bit about Julius Caesar, who was born into a patrician family but aligned himself with the populares, or the political faction supporting the people. He formed the first triumvirate, I did not pronounce that right, with Pompey and Crassus in 60 BCE to control Roman politics behind the scenes. So I think Julius Caesar might be one of the most highly debated men, like that you don't really know what they were doing, whether what they were doing was good. He was a military genius. He conquered Gaul, modern day France, and Belgium over several years. Then he basically spread a little bit of propaganda, commentaries on the Gallic War to promote his image back in Rome. And then he gained more popularity, more loyalty from troops. The Senate, led by Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return home, but he disagreed. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, which was an act of treason, by the way. And then a civil war occurred, but he won. And then he declared himself, of course, dictator for life in 44 BCE, which is one of the things that were very controversial about him. Because, one, he did do a lot of great things. He did land redistribution to the poor and veterans, so showed his love for the military people. He basically granted citizenship to people in provinces. He reformed the calendar, led to the Julian calendar, the more common one. But he reduced debt and regulated the grain supply and appointed more loyal senators, which weakened the old elite class. However, he did spread a lot of propaganda. He named himself a dictator, which is not looking that great for his image. But still, he did do a lot of stuff, even if it was with evil intentions or more selfish intentions. Et tu, Brute. You might have heard that phrase before, but on March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators, including his friend Brutus, which ended up triggering a civil war and destabilized Rome at the time. His adopted heir, Octavian, later named Augustus, took revenge and defeated the rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and became Rome's first emperor. So this basically gave the shift from a republic to, or I suppose Caesar already did that with naming himself dictator, but this was the first formal shift almost. What was wrong with Rome? Lots of things. So 30 to 40% of the Romans were slaves. You'd see bread and circus. Basically what that meant was, Basically what that meant was lots of the Roman higher ups would try to appease the poor people with entertainment. They would appease them with gladiator fights, stuff like that. They were giving them instead of doing the more important things, which is giving them food, giving them life, they just tried to blindfold their eyes and put on entertainment. They were trying to divert their focus, basically. So who was Spartacus? He was a Thracian gladiator who escaped from the gladiator school in Capua, and he became a leader of a major slave uprising, one of the biggest in Roman history. So he basically gathered an army of 70,000 to 120,000 escaped slaves and fought the Roman army for 2 years across southern Italy. In the beginning, he was going to escape Italy, but he was just gonna run. But the revolt grew into a bigger fight against slavery, but he was eventually crushed by General Crassus, and later Pompey helped him finish the cleanup. But the slaves were all crucified. It led to not much, but it was something where it was oh, this is kind of dangerous. The fall of Rome. So Germanic people invaded. that will be one of the things where it might pop up as a trick MCQ. But yeah, Germanic people invaded Rome. Um, there was political instability already at the time. There were like frequent changes in leadership, often through like violence or bribery. Like, I'm pretty sure Caesar was stabbed like 20 times or something. Civil wars weakened the government, corruption and inefficiency made ruling extremely difficult. And then there were a bunch of economic problems on top of that. Heavy taxes to fund the military and bureaucracy, which I guess that wasn't great. Um, there was a widening gap between the rich and poor and decline in trade and agriculture. There was the use of slave labor reduced innovation, which wasn't that great. Lots of military issues. They had like reliance on foreign mercenaries with little loyalty to Rome, constant invasion by Germanic tribes, like I was mentioning before. Roman army weakened and underfunded. There was even like a social decline. I didn't mention this here, but there was a decline in civic values like gravitas and loyalty to Rome. More people became apathetic or dependent on government support, and plagues and food shortages hurt morale and population sizes. So it wasn't going that great, basically. Christianity. So this is, yeah. Let's talk about the emergence of Christianity. Christianity is monotheistic, which is a belief in one God. They emphasized like themes like love, compassion, forgiveness towards others, including enemies. Was this upheld? No, because lots of wars were started where obviously this wasn't an important enough concept. Humility and equality, especially appealing to the poor and marginalized. So the one great thing was that unlike earlier forms, like in the beginning, what would happen in Roman empires would be that they would treat the king as a god. So like they would have the all power, and basically they could subjugate like the poor people to do whatever they wanted because obviously they were the best person here. But Christianity kind of changed that because it appealed to the poor and marginalized. They said, "Oh, you guys are also like important people. You guys are also allowed to have this faith and have eternal life and salvation." You would have a personal relationship that was like more intimate than usually what would be occurring at the time. Mission centers, you'd see mission centers, urban centers, trade routes, like there was lots of like many times what you'd see in many religions that they are this was one of the more missionary religions. It would spread fast, spread wide, really like conquering everything. And eventually it was adopted by Emperor Constantine and became the official version of the empire, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Or actually right here. Okay, Emperor Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. He basically issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. It helped unify Christian doctrine by calling the Council of Nicaea. I totally butchered that. But Christianity became increasingly connected to imperial power. So after the fall of Rome, which we discussed was from a variety of reasons, Christianity basically divides in half. So you'll see Eastern Orthodox Christianity, so more towards the eastern area, the Byzantine Empire. There were three defining features. They used Greek rather than the traditional Latin. They emphasized church councils and the authority of patriarchs rather than the Pope. And they focused more on mysticism and icons, so like statues or like of their god or whatever. But on the West, on the other hand, you'd see Roman Catholic churches. So Pope in Rome became the most powerful religious leader. It developed into Roman Catholicism, centered on Pope's authority. And then the Latin language was still retained here in worship and scripture. This is just, I guess, a quick break, I suppose, on just types of government. Or, wait, not this. I suppose it's just like, you'll see a lot of oligarchy, a lot of meritocracy. Okay, let's move on to China. So, there in the beginning there were like lots of warring states in China, so there were political chaos. During this period, there were seven major warring states that were in constant conflict with each other. They were all trying to like gain control. They all wanted to like unify the country, but kind of separately. The Zhao dynasty lost control, and the local rulers became more autonomous. This turmoil led to lots of philosophies and strategies to bring order to this chaos. I'm just going to briefly go over these. Confucianism emphasized social harmony, respect for tradition, and the role of virtuous leadership. Legalism advocated for strict laws, harsh punishments, and centralized control. It basically said that order could only be restored through strong governance. And then Taoism offered a contrasting view which promoted natural order and the importance of individual harmony with nature, but less focus on governance. If there's anything that you need to get from this, it's these three philosophies. Like, this will appear so much. You could use this in SAQs, LEQs, like, these three are very important. I would suggest going over them just one more time to be able to find the differences. The period also saw, like, lots of military technology, like the crossbow and tactics, strategy, like, all of this. Unification under the Qin dynasty. So, Qin Shi Huang, defeated the other 6 major states and unified China in 221 BCE. So this would end the Warring States period, and this would begin the imperial era. He emphasized legalism. Like, out of the 3 that we discussed, he chose legalism. So basically, another concept that was introduced was the mandate of heaven, which is basically that the emperor was chosen by God, and therefore you couldn't disagree against them. You couldn't, they were meant to be there, basically. He basically facilitated infrastructure projects like the Great Wall of China to fend off, like, the northern Mongol invaders, and extensive roads to facilitate communication and control across the empire. He also standardized weights, measures, writing, and currency, so this helped unify, like, all of these diverse regions. However, he had an autocratic rule, so he would basically burn the books and execute any scholar to, like, suppress dissent. He wouldn't allow, like, anyone to speak badly about him, and probably lots of propaganda from that too. How it collapsed was harsh policies, economic burdens, widespread resentment led to rebellion, and basically, like, everything, just all the bad stuff was exemplified. Trung Truc, or she was a Vietnamese heroine who led a rebellion against Chinese rule in the early 1st century CE. She and her sister led an uprising in what is northern Vietnam, and they were basically used as a symbol of resistance. They did eventually end up dying, but they held out for quite a long time, and they had, they organized a decent amount of soldiers, despite being women at the time, which not lots of women did that at the time. So this was very important. They were a symbol of resistance in Vietnam. Back to China. So there was a Chinese hierarchy. So you would see the emperor be on the top. Then you would see social bureaucrats and gentry people. Then you would see the working class and then the lower class. So basically, the lower class was like slaves, servants, prostitutes, entertainers, low-level government employees, military forces. But I think the working class is one of the more interesting ones. So in the working class, this was surprising, but peasants actually came first. Then you'd see artisans and merchants, and then you'd see soldiers. So the reason behind this was because China was very, I guess, against merchants at the time. They thought they were greedy, trying to fill their own pockets, and they were very anti-war, so they didn't like soldiers very much either. So they actually became below the peasants. So back to Confucianism. Again, this is really important. Definitely going to be on the test. So Confucianism was basically about filial piety, where it would basically discuss the ruler and subject. Well, there were like a bunch of things that were used here. You would see the ruler and subject, where the emperor was considered the father figure of the nation, and that the people owed them the loyalty. So your subject would have to enact filial piety against, like, the ruler. father and son. The father was like, the sons were expected to honor and obey their fathers. Same thing with husband and wife. Like, the men were dominant in the family, and the women were expected to be obedient to their husbands. And this translated also, this is the most popular one, but elder and younger. So you had to respect your elders. They had to basically say yes to them in all matters, regardless of what they were. Um, so some Chinese inventions that were popularized during this time was paper, which was invented during the Han Dynasty, printing. This is a bit later, but this was during the Tang Dynasty and Song Dynasty. The compass, which was originally used for divination, later for navigation. The wheelbarrow and blast furnaces. These were some important inventions that were made at the time. Let's move on to Han China. So Liu Bang came from a peasant family, which made him the first commoner to found a Chinese dynasty. They had a more moderate government. They learned from their mistakes, where they reduced all these harsh punishments and taxes while keeping Xin's centralized bureaucracy. And they had a really strong central government. They expanded civil service based on Confucianism. So they chose Confucianism. They realized legalism wasn't working. It was very harsh. People did not like it. So they switched to Confucianism. And Confucianism really played an emphasis on scholars. So basically, scholars moved up the ladder. Before, they were at the bottom. Now they're closer to the top. And the civil service exam was basically an exam that you had to take to be an important person. Like, lots of peasants basically took it, hoping that they could get to a higher position. They created the Imperial Academy to train scholars for government service, and officials were chosen through the exams. This is the earliest form of meritocracy. However, this was not always fair, because lots of times, like, you would get rejected, or people could bribe their way through the exams. Like, it wasn't completely bulletproof, but it was like the earliest form of meritocracy you would see. I already discussed technological and scientific advances, but seismographs to detect earthquakes. There were lots of medicine, astronomy, engineering feats, and then the Silk Roads, which we will discuss in the next unit, like next Saturday, as that will be an important thing, very important thing. Networks of exchange. Fall of Han China. There were lots of internal problems. So lots of corruption, court issues, especially involving like powerful eunuchs and royal relatives. There was a ginormous gap between rich and poor people. So like peasants were really taxed and they lost a lot of land. There were frequent peasant uprisings, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE, which basically severely weakened the empire. What the Yellow Turban Rebellion was like a bunch of Taoists basically against these tyrannical eunuchs. There was also a huge economic strain. The cost of expansion, military defense, and infrastructure put a strain on the treasury. Natural disasters such as floods and droughts hurt agriculture and increased unrest. And then, additionally, on top of that, local lords gained power and stopped obeying the central government. Okay, now we're moving on to India. So, a popular religion in India was Hinduism, which was not founded on one person but rather evolved over centuries. So, the Vedas and later Upanishads formed the core text. So, the core ideas were Brahman, or the ultimate reality, Atman, or the individual soul, Samsara, or the cycle of rebirth, and Karma, which is also translated to this day, moral law of cause and effect, and Moksha, which is liberation from the cycle and union with the Brahman. So they emphasized a lot of Dharma, or duty, which was tied to one's caste, and laws of Manu, where Brahmins held religious power through Vedic rituals and criticized for their control over spirituality. In response to this, in response to Buddhism, which I'll talk about on the next slide, it evolved into a more personal form of devotion or bhakti. So Buddhism was formed by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, in 6th century BCE, which sought a path beyond ritual and caste, which was something that was common in Hinduism, like the caste system. So I'm going to talk about this first. But it evolved in India around 1500 BCE, and there are 4 main classes. So Brahmins would be priests and scholars, and Kshatriyas would be warriors and rulers. Vaishyas would be merchants and artisans, Shudras would be laborers and servants. Later, untouchables or Dalits emerged below all Varnas, handling all the impure jobs. Jati system would be like within each Varna, people belong to specific jatis or subcastes based on their occupation. This provided social order, like this basically structured the empire into something that was controllable but limited mobility. Like people couldn't move between the classes. So if you were, let's say, a Shudra and you were like really good at medicine, you were like or you were a really good warrior, like you could fight all of these battles, like you would definitely have the strength to, you wouldn't be able to do that basically. You had to stick to these roles, and that basically led to a loss of talent. Um, Back to Buddhism, the core beliefs were like the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering. Do I know what this means? No. But it was like, I guess, gives you a good idea of what it was. Nirvana was liberation through detachment. So basically, Buddhism rejected caste and emphasized individual spiritual progress. They appealed to lower castes and women that often got the short end of the stick at the time. Very similar to Christianity. Spread beyond India via trade and missionaries, so you would see it spread into East Asia, all of like the Southeast. It was basically split. Oh, first, it was sponsored by Mauryan rulers like Ashoka that promoted as their own, like in their own empire, and it was split into two. So Mahayana Buddhism was more inclusive and deified the Buddhas. It basically made him into a god. However, Theravada Buddhism, what probably was the original one, was original, stricter path. Mahayana basically made it so that anyone could be a Buddhist. They didn't have to like detach themselves from all the world. They didn't have to like leave behind all these like spiritual or material attachments. So Buddhism spread into China, which would lead to a lot of syncretism. Speaking of syncretism is basically the blending of cultures. So this is also a very key idea in AP World. Many times we'll be like, I'll talk about this a bit later when I'm discussing the Silk Roads, but it'll be like, what what are some specific examples of syncretism? And you could bring something like this up. Which article is this? Okay. Now let's move on to Africa, the Americas, and Pacific Ocean. Yeah. So, in many early societies, men and women operated in different but complementary spheres. In agriculture and African societies, both genders had social roles, even if not equal. In Africa, you would see Meroe, or the Kingdom of Kush, south of Egypt, known for ironworking, female rulers, and distinct architecture, a blend of African and Egyptian culture. You would also see another important place called Axum, which was located in modern day Ethiopia. And it was actually a Christian kingdom, so it was pretty isolated from the rest of it. Known for their massive stone obelisk or columns of Axum and long distance trade. The Niger River Valley civilization developed without centralized states or kings organized through networks of specialists and trade. One important thing is Bantu. Like the Bantu expansion, it was the gradual migration of Bantu-speaking people across sub-Saharan Africa, which spread along with it agriculture, iron tools, and language shaping much of African culture, and caused the crop diffusion of bananas and yam across sub-Saharan Africa. Another important civilization is the Swahili civilization, which was like a Bantu language, and it ended up being an important trade port later on. The Americas, an important thing in the Americas was also a tribute system. I will discuss this later, along with like China's tribute system, similar to tribute system, but you would basically have to pay a certain amount of stuff all of the citizens would have to do that to the government. But in Mesoamerica, there were three important civilizations at the time. Olmec, known as the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, giant stone heads, calendar systems. Maya, this is one of the more popular ones. They were advanced in math, astronomy, written script, and city-states with pyramids. I'm gonna butcher that. Teotihuacan was another massive city in central Mexico with pyramids, influential in trade and culture. Indian civilizations include Chavan, Moche, Wari, and Tiwanaku. Chavan was a religious center in the Andes known for stone art and widespread influence. Mochi was a warrior society known for elaborate pottery and irrigation systems. And Wari and Tiwanaku were early Indian states that prefigured the Inca, another popular one, had planned cities and terracing. North Americans. Some popular things in North America were the Sky Woman Falling, or the Haudenosaunee creation story, which reflects indigenous understanding of nature, kinship, and balance. I would suggest reading it. It's very interesting. And Ancestor Pueblo, or the Chaco phenomenon, which included massive buildings, road systems, and astronomical alignment in the American Southwest. There was no written language here. And mound builders, or Cahokia, or major cities with earth mounds near modern St. Louis, complex trade and hierarchy. We can't forget about Pacific Oceania, which Australian Dreamtime, which had aboriginal myths of creation and land and emphasized deep spiritual connection to the environment and ancestors. So this class actually finished really fast, faster than I thought. I would say that this is an introduction. This kind of prefaces like most of the stuff I'm gonna build on, like into the Silk Roads, the bigger waves of civilization and stuff. Yeah, I hope this was interesting.